Alright, so I'm back making new stuff, and the first one's got Frontier in the title. How I spoil you guys. This is kinda the next stop on the Frontier journey for this channel. It's the game that got me started on YouTube, honestly, and it's kinda, sorta, the focal point game of the channel, even if that really wasn't my intention. So, as my relationship and perspective on the game grows and evolves, I think it's only right to continue making videos along that journey. By the way, stay tuned towards the end of this video, because I actually have a project to announce that's going to tell you where Frontier content is going to go from here. It's time, once again, I think, to stand up for my boys and make sure they have a proper voice in their favor. Because here's the thing, I fought every Frontier monster at this point, all of them, every original creature, the hardcores, the exotics, the zeniths, and the musos. And I gotta say that in the case of Frontier's wholly original, brand new species additions to Monster Hunter, well, for the most part, barring like some of the big name bosses, they're kinda just Monster Hunter monsters. And I say this to hopefully erode some stigma against them that still exists, as well as a way to kinda, I would say, demystify some aspects of Frontier, especially most things before G rank and some things that come after G rank as well. Thankfully, I don't think these monsters need as much support as they may once have needed. A lot of people who are big Monster Hunter fans have actually played Frontier for themselves at this point, and most realize just how good the game actually is, though the recreated servers certainly aren't widely played amongst, say, more casual Monster Hunter fans still. Now, this video isn't necessarily another plea for these monsters to be brought back into Wilds or any other game. I've already made those videos. This is, I guess, more of like a PR project that wants to show you that these beasts aren't really all that different from their main series counterparts. Not so much in terms of design, and not as much as you'd think when it comes to combat philosophy. Not all of Frontier is the stereotype that the last years of the game presents itself as being. In fact, I would say the majority of Frontier simply pushes up against the boundaries of conventional Monster Hunter, rather than outright breaking through them. Frontier was in a place that was a bit unfortunate for its perception. It was dying off when World was coming out. A lot of people became fans of the very grounded, naturalistic, and environmentally well-integrated animals and fell in love with that aspect of Monster Hunter. And then you hear that, oh, there's this long-running Japanese MMO for Monster Hunter, currently still going, and it looks like this. And it's not a shock that the general opinion was, well, that's a lot. I kind of thought so too, to be honest. I bought into the bad designs, not real animals, too spiky, too many AoEs, too iframe dependent, too try-hard, too over-designed narrative for a little while. And the thing is, I don't know if I ever actually really believed that. I might have just kind of nodded along with a consensus that existed. I mean, to some extent, it wasn't untrue. Frontier had to be pushed to the point of being ludicrous just because power creep sort of needed to be a thing. The game was 12 years old, and yeah, when you get into the zeniths, the proportions and the spikes do kind of go all over the place. But here's a little thing about me. I used to follow Frontier a long time ago, back when Try was a new release. I'd spent a lot of time on the old fandom wikis and found out about Frontier's monsters, back when the game had only been around for 2 or 3 years at that point. And I check up on trailers and new monster editions every now and again, and I thought they were really cool. And when Espinas came to Sunbreak and there was all that buzz about Frontier monsters making a comeback, I decided to revisit the roster, see what was actually in there. I made those 2 giant videos, started streaming the game, and here we are today. And the beasts are pretty great. Yeah, the musos, the zeniths, the shitans are pretty wild, and you couldn't just port the monsters as they are into the mainline games for design, animation, and combat philosophy reasons. But I especially want to talk about the 50 or so original monsters that the game made and make a case for them not really being that heavily divorced from their mainline cousins, at least least in most places. Yeah, in a couple of areas they do get kind of bonkers, but for the most part, I don't think they're that off. After learning about and fighting all of them personally, I don't think there's any entry where if you asked me if I thought they could work in the ongoing main series Monster Hunter games, my answer would be flat out no. And that goes for fights I straight up don't like Farunoku. He could always be tooled around to be made less obnoxious. And that goes for monsters with really strong debilitating gimmicks like Garubadora. You can tone down Crystal Blight a little bit, and I think he's more stuck in a bad arena than he is an actually bad monster. And I wouldn't say no to monsters with pretty rough designs like Erizarion, because that could totally be fixed with better time and technology. And I wouldn't say no to crazy over-the-top monsters like Dure Mudira, because even though he, as he is, would be way too much for main series Monster Hunter games, we've already proven that we can absolutely have these crazy spectacle fights be insanely well designed in ways that fit the modern games. Let's actually talk about combat philosophy, because I think that's kind of the core sticking point with some of these guys. As Frontier went on, it progressively became more and more insistent on the player using perfect timing mechanics, guard counters, parries, and especially iframe evading. This definitely becomes the case around the end of Frontier G and into Frontier Zenith, when the predominant endgame was the Musos, the Zeniths, and the Sheetan variations. There's some of this as well with, say, like the Supremacy monsters at the very, very end of the high rank experience, but the Supremacy monsters also just aren't all that great anyways. You can see the shift really beginning, I think, around G rank when the weapons received what was called extreme style. The big gimmick here was that all of the weapons could sprint, and that's because the monsters were gradually getting to the point where their attacks were so large and the time between their attack animations were so quick that you had to be more aggressive and have more speed to actually get in. Additionally, a lot of the more powerful Frontier skills only proc after a period of time with you having your weapon unsheathed, so you are encouraged to sheath as little as possible in end-level Frontier, if at all. Ideally, you want to be using perfect blocks and iframes to negate damage while your weapon is still drawn, rather than sheathing and rolling or Superman diving. Classic Monster Hunter tends to have a little bit more of a bait and punish combat philosophy, whereas Frontier wanted you to get in, power through, and exploit. You had to learn to not be afraid of the monster's giant attacks and see them as openings instead. Weapon sprinting was needed so you could actually keep up with the monsters, following after their rapid movements so you could properly exploit those attacks. So, if you watch high-level gameplay of Frontier, a lot of what you're going to see is players perfectly evading through gigantic map-encompassing detonations to exploit that move's end lag. This, I think, is what makes these monsters a little bit off-putting to some people. There is an expectation of perfection here that you wouldn't want to put on your traditional Monster Hunter game. Let's talk about why this isn't really a problem for most of the original species that Frontier offers, though. For one thing, a lot of monsters we're actually talking about weren't, or had versions that weren't, fully designed for this perfectionist mentality. The majority of Frontier's original monster cast can be fought before G rank, before perfect timings became the norm. Yeah, it's still a good idea to get adjusted to the idea of using iframes early, as it will make the tougher high rank fights more fun and easier to deal with, and some attacks are much easier to evade while using iframes, but a good number of them don't actually demand that you use them. You totally can sheath, run away, Superman dive, bait, run in, and punish for most of these fights. I tried it out myself actually, just to prove the point. Fought a couple of high rank, or technically they're go rank, because Frontier had a kind of in-betweeners, bit of difficulty between high and G monsters called go rank, some of which were initially introduced in G and got scaled back down to be fought earlier in the game. And I also fought some monsters that were introduced earlier in the game's life cycle to see if that mentality carried through still. One of these foes I went after was the first phase of Guanzorumu, the big bad super boss of the 10th and final update of Monster Hunter Frontier G, right before the Zenith monsters arrived. I purposefully stripped myself of evade window and ran the basic Earth-style switch axe, which is basically just the switch axe from Monster Hunter Tri. In his first phase moveset, I really only felt like there was one attack in his whole arsenal that felt like it wanted me to be using iframes specifically, and that is his heavy slam down wing attack that sends air currents in all directions. There's also his really quick roar that goes into the flame vortex move, but obviously earplugs can counter that. You can dodge the tremor creating paw slams by getting behind him, and most of his giant flame breath attacks can be dodged by running to his sides. He's got a couple of wonky hitboxes with a few charge attacks and whatnot, but that's also a general second generation Elder Dragon problem, so I don't chalk that up to being iframe demand necessarily. If you don't overcommit and get out before you get greedy, you can dodge most of this incredibly powerful, late in the game, Frontier Elder Dragon's attacks in a conventional second generation manner. Granted, his kit is way more fun to deal with if you're using blocks and iframes, but you absolutely can do it fairly without them. It's just much tougher, and you probably are going to be wanting to sheath, run, and punish a lot. I tried the same experiment out on a few other monsters. The other downscaled G-rank monster I tried is honestly even more egregious with his AoE and ranged attacks, this being the watery weapons platform known as Gurea Domos. That's right, I willingly, of my own volition, chose to fight Gurea Domos with 0 iframes and Earth-style switch axe for you people. If that doesn't earn me a like on this fucking video, nothing will. And he was definitely a little bit more of a hassle, but again, there was only really one move where I genuinely struggled to deal with it without iframes, and that was this tailspin that he has. A lot of his other charges and water mines and water beams could be conventionally dealt with if I played well. And just to see for myself, I went after some earlier life cycle Frontier monsters like Abiorugu and Berukirosu. And yeah, you can obviously fight them with no iframes whatsoever. Now, this argument isn't completely universal. A few of Frontier's original foes, I would say the 4 monsters introduced in Frontier Z, those being Erizerion, Bogabadorumu, Xenocerisu, and Keoaruboru, as well as the insanely dangerous Durerumudira and a few other G-rank exclusives like Disofiroa and Miru, definitely start to skew in the iframe demand direction. But my point remains that the majority of Frontier's original monsters, especially the more rank and file, locale-dwelling animalistic ones, have movesets that already are not that demanding of perfection from you, and a lot of their powerful attacks and gimmicks are either telegraphed enough that you can conventionally evade them, or they can be circumnavigated with armor skills. You could put the high-rank versions of many of Frontier's original monsters in Tri-Ultimate and get them to work well with a couple of changes and a little bit of tweaking down, and a few needing, I think, next to no changes whatsoever. They'd rank among the tougher fights in the game, but they would work. The vast majority of Frontier's monsters that you could not port into mainline Monster Hunter or would need to heavily downgrade to the point of altering their core combat philosophy are things like Zeniths, Musos, and Shitans, which are variations that, again, we're not even looking at for this video's consideration. The attacks that I think would need to go or be heavily reworked for the most part are the floor explosion moves, where monsters can just summon huge fields of elemental blast effects underneath themselves. You probably don't want too many of those, especially at the size and scope that they exist in Frontier. My second point partially invalidates the first, but only a little. That first argument's intent was to display that the existing baseline of Frontier monsters is not wholly incompatible with the conventional gameplay philosophy of Monster Hunter. It pushes against the limits of those conventions at times and can be made better with iframes, but the baseline certainly still functions without much need for downscaling for the majority of monsters. This next argument almost kind of goes without saying, but there's an odd perception about Frontier monsters that I think needs to be kneecapped completely. Incarnations of a monster can only be judged for how they work within the parameters of the game that they are in. And yeah, no shit. But at the same time, there's an argument that gets floated around that Frontier monsters are nothing but AoE spamming and demand nothing but perfection, and that's why they're bad and they shouldn't be put in mainline. Here's the thing. Even if that was true, it doesn't matter in the slightest if they get adapted for another game. Wild's Rathalos could not function in Monster Hunter 1. It would shred you to bits. The combo patterns, the movement, the aggression could not be properly compensated for. But this does not make Wild's Rathalos badly designed. It's the best core Rathalos in the entire franchise, and it also doesn't make it not Rathalos. Seems obvious, but I think due to the fact that the Frontier monsters have a singular incarnation, and that singular incarnation is in an over-the-top spin-off, that they have this perceived static nature. Even in this script, I refer to them as Frontier monsters, which I think kind of separates them. It's an easy means of identification, but it also puts them in a bit of a box. A hypothetical Wilds Dure Mudira would not be Frontier's Dure Mudira. It would have the same core ice and poison identity, it can have similar animations and effects, it could probably do some attacks that are fundamentally similar to how the Frontier Dure Mudira uses them, but the scale, the speed, the damage, the combo pathing, the telegraphs, the end lag on these attacks would have to be altered to properly accommodate for how Wilds works. And of course, some moves would have to be taken out, and new ones would need to be added in. maybe Dure Mudira is not exactly the best example, because he's probably the nuttiest lunatic out of this game's original species, and honestly, he's probably never getting out of Frontier in the first place, but the point still stands. He works in Frontier, and in the hypothetical situation where they let that thing out of containment and put it into a different Monster Hunter game where he worked just as well, he'd still be Dure Mudira, and there's nothing that says that something like that can't be done. And thirdly, when it comes to combat philosophy, we gotta talk about how several of the more recent Monster Hunter games have been trending. Monster Hunter has been encouraging us to use perfect timing mechanics for a little while now. Ever since Adept style in Generations, we then got Valor style in Generations Ultimate, a ton of Silkbind counters in Rise and Sunbreak for better or for worse, and now we're in Wilds, a Monster Hunter title with some of the series' strongest combat to date. And we have a distribution of counters, perfect blocks, offset attacks, perfect evade mechanics, camera positioning controls that allow for quicker turnarounds and better reaction times, as well as several skills and fights that incentivize the use of iframe evading through monster attacks without demanding that they are used. Now, this isn't like Endgame Frontier, where the name of the game is learn your iframe timings or you're going to die, and it never should, but I do think it's kind of cool that monsters are being designed in a way where they can be dealt with conventionally while being even more engaging and exhilarating if fought using timing-oriented mechanics. Honestly, that's fairly close to the design philosophy of many of the Frontier monsters that can be fought before G rank. Some changes required, obviously, but the overarching philosophy is kinda close. And it's not just the fact that both games have monsters where the attacks are more fun to engage with if you use iframes. One of my favorite things about Wilds is the camera and positioning fluidity that focus mode grants you. It allows the monster to have some more complex maneuvers where it tries to flank you, to get behind you, making the beast feel more inventive. A lot of my favorite fights in the game make solid use of that mechanic. Well, there's quite a few attacks in Frontier that have similar cross-up properties to them. They want to put the monster behind you to make you feel more vulnerable. Now, the design is slightly different. The Frontier attacks are designed more to test your reaction time, as you may not be able to physically see them coming at you and you need to rely on your internal clock. Moves like these could very well be reinterpreted to suit the turn speed of Wilds' focus mode, though. You certainly couldn't port all of these attacks over to Wilds one for one. However, I do find it fascinating that there are several ways in which the combat philosophy of Wilds and early to mid-level Frontier were designed parallel to one another. It makes sense that these two games probably have my favorite Monster Hunter combat in them. With the right pushes and the right pulls and mathematical tweaking and animation altering, I think you could have a baseline established in Frontier for fight design that could be translated into combat suited for Wilds extremely well, with most monsters not needing to lose too many of their original attacks. The other major area worth defending these guys on is their design. Again, the most batshit crazy ones with the wackiest, most out there proportions and nuttiest designs, the ones you think of when you hear about how spiky and busy Frontier monsters are, that's mostly just the Zeniths. And again, not talking about those guys. In most cases, honestly, I think the Frontier originals don't really deviate from the design conventions of especially modern Monster Hunter monsters, but they're stuck on a PS2, maybe PS3 graphics engine. I don't know if we really have any grounds to say that we dislike super spiky monsters on principle, when we have universally beloved monsters like JunBTacuyan and Gigante out there. I'm not sure we can say we dislike super flashy, intricate, complex designs on principle when Thunmbnail would probably win the greatest Monster Hunter monster design ever award if we were to have that discussion. It just comes down to execution. A lot of these modern guys have the luxury of being made on engines with color technology and modeling that allows them to be more carefully crafted. Frontier's originals lack that benefit, yet they try to go with the more colorful and intricate and loud designs anyways. I think main series monsters and Frontier monsters developed in design complexity along the same trajectory, but the technology gap made one look exceptional and the other one look bizarre and cartoony. Now that doesn't mean they're all 100% winners in need of just a teeny little cleanup. Miraganasu, for example, is a bit of a mess with giant ears and 3 huge horns sticking off of his head in all different directions, as well as tons of spikes and glowing yellow vents and a tail that looks like it ends in an exhaust pipe. And then, there's Eruzerion, who I think you could get to work, despite the fact that he's very on the nose as a fire and ice monster. If you gave him stronger base colors and kind of flushed out the silver on his body, you give him better particle effects, and you make it so that his fur doesn't look like it's made out of blue and orange highlighter, as well as trim down those horn proportions a little bit, you can make him look a lot more respectable. We pretty much already have proof that this would work fine for the bulk of the cast. The comparison between Espinas's Frontier and Sunbreak renders is pretty major. His expression is much fiercer, the thorns are downsized to look a little less cumbersome, and their pink blends with his green scales better where the two interact. He's a little bit slimmer, and he's obviously much more detailed with superior scale texture. The only area for improvement with the Sunbreak model would maybe be a happy medium between the saturation of the two. With the right touch-ups, any blocky fur textures could look more flowing, and you can make any goofy looking expression or odd face sculpt look fiercer or at least more natural. Any monsters that may be a tad too saturated can be toned down, and any overbearing spikes can be reined in a little. Oh, and maybe Gasora Bazora can stop having literally the second worst render ever and be recognized for the pretty cool creature that he actually is. For real though, properly updated Gasora Bazora. That would look kinda sick. Additionally, Frontier's original species were not created as mere rule of cool, single arena boss fights. Though not as meticulously crafted as some main series beasts, there is a good amount of thought put into the ecology of many monsters introduced here. Baruragaru is an invasive species that has been menacing the raptor populations of the swamps and deserts with little intervention. Hujikiki's body contains several organs that pumps highly potent toxins into the fatty material that forms the spikes on his back. The Orugarons mate for life, fight alongside one another, and have special interactions when together or when one is slain. Oribatoras actively preys upon Kuravashimu. Gogamoa carries around its young with them and has a system in its body that creates a strong silk substance which can combine with its adhesive saliva to make for insanely strong and powerful webshot attacks. Kuwarasepusu gains different powers and abilities depending on whether or not the crystals on its back absorb sunlight or electricity, and these powers can be amplified if he is in more extreme weather conditions. Abiorugu can be a social animal and will occasionally hunt with other members of his own species to give himself an edge over other monsters. The grounded ecological DNA of the series has not been lost on these guys, almost at all. So that is what I have found while researching, fighting, and contemplating the monsters made for Frontier. For the most part, well, they're just kind of Monster Hunter monsters. They push up against the limitations of certain physical and combative design limitations that conventional Monster Hunter adheres to, but most of them still function near within its confines for the most part. Some of the models are pretty crazy and out there, but there's just as crazy monsters in the mainline series who are able to be actualized better. And yes, some of these guys want you to be using iframes and perfect blocks, but until you get to the very last few years of the game's lifespan, this really wasn't demanded by the game that regularly. There's so much quality within the 12 years of Monster Hunter Frontier, and most of it is just Monster Hunter. A little hyperbolized and in need of some proper reorientation, but that last point goes for any monster that's ever going to be ported into a newer title. I think the parallels that you can draw between the creature and combat philosophies of Wilds and Frontier show that these creatures definitely do belong, and there aren't just weirdos made for some weirdo spin-off game. In some places, I think they were really just kind of ahead of their time. They're legitimate monsters made for a specific Monster Hunter game, just like how a first-gen monster like Diablos or a 6th-generation monster like New Udra is. The context for the specific Monster Hunter entry absolutely does matter. The difference is just a little less dramatic than first impressions might have led you to believe. So, like I said, I have a bit of an announcement for the end of this video. A lot of time was devoured by the world review, a ton of time. And though I think it'll be a while before I do anything quite that ambitious again, I still do like my giant projects, and I recognize that I need the ability to fill in for lost time to keep the channel healthy during those long production periods. Wild's updates and streams were all I had for months. Additionally, it's nice to have an easy fallback plan if I get a little bit of video maker's block, or want to make a few extra bucks at the end of a month, or I'm just between a few projects that take a week or two. So we're going to be continuing on with my personal journey with Frontier. I showcase them all from an outsider's perspective. I fought them live for the first time on stream. I've made my case for those that should be in Wilds, and now I've done some work to establish that they really aren't that far off from conventional Monster Hunter monsters and deserve to be treated as normal members of the franchise. Now, I want to talk about them individually, give each of them their own time to shine. I gave my opinions on the Frontier monsters from a secondary source perspective in those original videos. Now we're going to do primary source perspective. I'm going to go one by one, give each Frontier monster its own video, talking about just how good it is, how its moves and gimmicks feel to play against, what weapons I enjoy running against them, all that kind of stuff. I feel like this is simultaneously going to be a very fun passion project, a great step in this Frontier saga for the channel, and an effective business move that will give me a ton of potential videos I can make in relatively short order while still being able to put in some good effort and having something insightful to add. I hope you look forward to these. I'm going to start trial running this new project fairly soon, and speaking of ambitious projects, my 10.5-hour celebration and critique of Monster Hunter World Iceborne is up on the channel, and if you haven't watched it yet and have a long shift at work to get through or need some sleep aid, I think you'll enjoy it. It's some of my best work, and I'm hoping it has some solid longevity to it. As for now, though, this has been CR-Volcanic, or Connor. I'll see you around.